Our current situation, it is escalating. So, Professor, what were the possible missteps that could have resulted in this situation right now with over, 70 community cases in the past week with more than 10 unlinked?
So when the community situation remains under control, as what we have seen in March to early April, where we have very few or even long stretches of zero community cases, the real risk was always going to come from imported cases. And this is the same with every country and jurisdiction, including those that are now struggling to contain rising number of cases again, such as Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam. So we have always knew that the cases were going to come in from overseas. And this is really why countries like Australia, like New Zealand, have practically sealed off their borders to travelers, including sometimes to even their own citizens who will be traveling from the worst hit places. Now, for Singapore, we can see that the number of imported cases was rising from February onwards, and this was in line with the situation happening globally, particularly in countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia, where the majority of our migrant worker and domestic helper workforce comes from. So perhaps if we had taken the decision to impose stricter quarantine measures, such as moving to a 21-day quarantine protocol with repeated testing, and to also minimize any non-essential travel from affected countries, the current situation may not have been as bad. But I think it's important to highlight that Changi Airport's reputation for connectivity in Asia Pacific, as well as Singapore's reputation for global trade and travel, remain one of the most crucial lifelines for the overall economy. And when I say overall economy, it goes beyond just the maritime sector, the construction works or flats, apartments, or even for domestic helpers, but actually straight to the global reputation of Singapore and Changi Airport and what the country has to offer as a globally connected economy. Our ability to keep Changi Airport functioning as much as possible is actually existential to Singapore. So I think we really need to look at what the science tells us about the changing nature of the coronavirus and to put in place the necessary border control restrictions that allows us to balance between the public health of Singapore and also our bloodline, which is our economy.
Right. Well, expanding more on Changi Airport, it is the biggest active cluster in Singapore right now. How is an airport cluster more difficult to manage than, say, the cluster at Tan Tock Seng Hospital? Because, movement within the airport is more free, so to speak.
Well, I think we have to look at what happens in a hospital setting, because we typically would have only 3 groups of people in a hospital, including the people who are the workers, and that goes beyond just the healthcare workers. It includes the auxiliary staff, the cleaners, the canteen operators. The second group will be the visitors, and of course, the final group will be the patients. Now, of these 3 groups, you will notice that the patients and the hospital workers can be ring-fenced very effectively during an outbreak because we know who they are. And hospitals can actually reach out to the visitors as well, because there is right now a limited number of visitors allowed each day, and we keep track of who has been to where and when. So the movements of visitors, patients, the workers in the hospitals are very much limited. Because when we even look at the group working in the hospital, typically they work in zones as well. Now, what all this means is that when there's an outbreak in a part of a hospital, we actually have a lot of information on how to trace the contact patterns and how to perform that ring fencing that we always talk about to minimize subsequent spread in the transmission chain. But now if we look at what happens in an airport, if we only have travelers, air crew, and airport workers, then actually an outbreak in the airport again will be quite confined and traceable. But in the case of Singapore, I think what works very well during peacetime to build Changi Airport's reputation as one of the best airports in the world, including the shopping, the dining, the recreational facilities, now actually means that we have a much more diverse group of people who may be at the airport, not to travel, but for other recreational purposes. So during COVID times, where the airport in general may be seen as higher risk location, especially with incoming or transit travelers from different parts of the world, having this mix of travelers as well as recreational seekers actually means that when an outbreak happens, it is much harder to perform that ring fencing to just 1 or 2 locations or 1 or 2 sectors. But now we have seen some of the people that are infected are students, some are employees of different sectors. We now have to expand our ring fencing to schools and to also work sites. So it is much harder because of the mix as well as the type of movement patterns that's coming in because of our reputation for our airport.